Welcome to the Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas, hide in the margins, because the best parts, they're between the lines. Today, we are going to talk about one of my favorite authors. He sold about $400 million worth of books, survived a near-death accident, and once wrote a novel he doesn't even remember because he was on cocaine. This is the life of Stephen King. Now, this is going to be a jam-packed episode about Stephen King, a review of his most popular books, a breakdown of each, what they have in common, and how they compare to their movies. I'll even give my hot takes about the new HBO Max series, Welcome to Derry. Buckle up and relax, lean back, and enjoy the episode. Let's start out with The Boy Who Ate Horror, the early life of Stephen King. King was born in 1947 in Portland, Maine, which makes sense to me because a lot of his stories, you'll notice they end up in Maine. And at age 2, his father abandoned his family. He was raised by his mom and brother. He came from poverty, and they moved 8 times before settling in Durham, Maine. At age 6, King started writing. He copied comics. He sold stories to his aunt for quarters. And his first, air quote, hit was at age 9, which is called Jonathan and the Witches. King was obsessed with comics, B-movies, Lord of the Flies, and in high school, he wrote for his brother's Underground Paper, and he sells his first prose story in 1965. For college, he went to the University of Maine, where he met Tabitha in a poetry workshop. Tabitha is King's wife, and he graduated in 1970. I mentioned before that there's a story that King wrote that he doesn't even remember writing. And that's because, like a lot of passionate creatives, he had some substance abuse. I actually want to recommend a book that I'm reading right now called Daily Rituals. And one of the common factors I find in a lot of these passionate creatives is that they all use some sort of substance, whether it's something that unlocks their creativity or just makes them happy. It just seems to be a common theme. So let's talk about his family and sobriety. So in 1971, King marries Tabitha. And King, when he wrote the book Carrie, which we're going to talk about, he was so frustrated that he actually threw it in the trash and she saved it. King has 3 children, Naomi and Joe Hill and Owen. In the 1980s, King struggled with alcohol and cocaine, which, going off really quick, he wrote the story Cujo, but couldn't recall writing it because he was on cocaine and alcohol at the time. It was in 1986 that his wife staged an intervention, and ever since then, he's been sober. In 1999, I mentioned earlier that King had a near-death experience, and it was this year that he was hit by a van, and he almost had his leg nearly amputated. It required 5 surgeries, and while in pain and recovering, he wrote Dreamcatcher. Let's talk about King's career and how it launched. It first started with Carrie, where he was given a $2,500 advance, and that was turned into a film. And at that time, when his career really catapulted, he quit teaching. He was actually a teacher and a writer at the same time. And then he was writing under a secret pen name, Richard Bachman, and he wrote 5 novels, which ranged from 1977 to 1985. And he was exposed in 1985 and that Bachman was actually Stephen King. In total, Stephen King has written 65 plus novels and 200 plus short stories. The big ones, of course, are the ones that have been turned into series and movies. One of my favorites is The Shining, which was released in 1977. There's It, The Killer Clown, and The Stand in 1978, and then the Dark Tower series, which there's 8 books, and they span from 1982 to 2012. And then there's some experiments that he tried with writing, which was The Green Mile and Riding the Bullet and The Plant. And then adaptations, and let's talk about impact. So over 60 plus films and TV series have been made from King's writings. Shawshank Redemption, which is a really well-known classic, it's actually a Stephen King story. And what I think it's interesting about that is it has such a different, when I say different, it's not in the typical style of King. And when I say typical style, I mean, it's not a thriller, it's not a horror, although there's a lot of, like, there's some disturbing things that happen in Shawshank, but this was a very different story from the typical Stephen King novel. But next, you also have The Shining, which was directed by Stanley Kubrick. This may sound controversial, but I actually prefer Stanley Kubrick's version more than Stephen King's. I thought that Kubrick's was a perfect ending. I thought that Stephen King's was too cute. That's okay. That's just my opinion. And then in 2017, there was It. And of course, there was an earlier version with Tim Curry. And it's known for being the biggest horror film ever. There's also a lot of cameos of his stories found in It. There's chapters 1 and 2, The Simpsons, Sons of Anarchy. It also influenced big series such as Stranger Things, and also I would say that the modern horror series and film top, I guess, genre really owes a lot to Stephen King as being someone who pushed the horror genre and thriller into popularity. Now for some fun facts. So Stephen King was actually a rock star and plays in an author band called Rock Bottom Remainders with Amy Tan and Dave Barry. He was a radio DJ. He owned 3 main stations, and he sold those in 2024. He's a diehard Red Sox superfan. He co-wrote Faithful in 2004, World Series, and he wrote comics, wrote The American Vampire in 2010. And let's see, what else is something that's interesting here? Digital Pioneer, when that was released, it crashed servers with the ebook launch. And as far as philanthropy and politics, I actually think this is kind of interesting because I think once in a while you might hear some things from Stephen King that you're like, oh, interesting. I guess it's interesting to hear his take on events going around the world. But he gives $4 million a year to libraries, schools, fire departments, and Ukraine aid. That's interesting. And then he's known for being pretty progressive, which makes sense, given that Maine is a blue state. He's a big proponent of gun control, higher taxes on rich. He endorsed Obama, Biden, and Harris, and he testified in 2002 in a publishing trial. So let's go to the present day, 2024, 2025. So now Stephen King is 78, and he's still writing. He wrote You Like It Darker. In 2025, he wrote Never Flinch. And then his latest gaffe, we'll actually skip that. But one of his quotes on writing is that he reads a lot and he writes a lot. Basic, but makes sense. I feel like those two things go hand in hand. Now, to unpack some of the writing elements that are found in Stephen King's writings, he explores fear, not just as monsters, but as metaphors, addiction, grief, abuse, isolation, the fragility of sanity. You find a lot of that actually in The Shining, which I think is really fascinating. And there's a lot of symbolism, like I mentioned before, like with it essentially, if you're not familiar with who it is the killer clown that when he goes to attack his prey, he turns into some of their worst fears, but eventually it ends up being a clown. But it's a metaphor. I mean, it is something that is can morph into whatever your fear is, which I think is fascinating. He also transforms referring to King, not it, but King transforms the ordinary American settings into sites of terror, which I think is very noticeable. Like if you watch Children of the Corn, this is just a small town, and it seems very normal, boring. Same with Derry and all these other towns and settings where families settle. They seem normal, but they're everything but normal. There's a lot of abnormal and horror behind the facade of normality. He also shows how people confront darkness, internally and externally. And he also highlights how love, memory, and moral strength can overcome evil, which is something that is common in all of his books. So from a broke kid in Maine to the king of horror, Stephen King proves that the scariest stories start with real life. Now, we're going to talk about some of my favorite books. And I'm going to start with number 1, Misery, which was released in 1987. This is one of my favorite books because it seems like such a basic plot, but when you're reading it, the writing is really well done. It keeps you glued to the pages, and it's one of those few times where I actually sweat while I read this, just hearing about what's going on to our protagonist. So let's talk about what this story is about if you're not familiar with it. But the protagonist is a famed novelist named Paul Sheldon, who gets into a car accident during a winter storm and is rescued by his number one fan, Annie Wilkes. She is famous for using the phrase cock-a-doodle. And she takes him to a remote home, but then ends up trapping him when she discovers he killed off her favorite character, Misery Chastain. Because Paul Sheldon, he writes these romance novels, and she is obsessed with them. They are her light, they are her joy. And Annie forces him to write a new novel reviving Misery after she reads the manuscript, and she torments him psychologically and physically. And Paul has to outwit her to survive. When I say he tortures her, or she tortures him psychologically and physically, it is brutal. At one point, she chops off his leg. And in other cases, she makes him do things like burn his manuscript and rewrite it from scratch. So it almost kind of sounds like a author's hell, where you're trapped by your number one fan and you're in a place where you can't do anything to escape, and your best chance of survival are by appeasing your number one fan. Now, Stephen King's motive for writing Misery was really as a metaphor for his addiction to drugs and alcohol and the pressures of fame. And he represents both a deranged fan and his own dependency, something that both nurtures but also destroys him. And I think it's that parallel between the author and his fan base that relates to alcohol, right? It's something that that becomes a dependency but also brings joy. So some interesting parallels there. Some of the key themes from Misery are, again, obsession and control. That is Annie Wilkes to a T. She is controlling her author. She's torturing him, forcing him to get what she wants. And then there's a relationship between the creator and fan. Like I said, I see this as a story about an author's hell. And then there's addiction and withdrawal, isolation, and survival. In this book, it seems like in a lot of his books that you've got the main characters and the monsters that they have to avoid and survive are all in an isolated environment. Now, let's talk about some of the symbolism from Misery. The typewriter. This shows creativity turned into torture. There's Annie, who's a manifestation of addiction, obsession, and toxic devotion. Now, the broken legs, which I mentioned before, when Paul Sheldon gets hobbled, which is what Annie Wilkes talks about, the history of that word. And there's the crippling effect of fame and dependency. There is a film that was released that was directed by Rob Reiner, starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. I actually think this is really well done. I highly recommend it. But it stays close to the novel, but kind of softens some of the violence. And Bates actually won an Oscar for her terrifying, yet sympathetic portrayal of Annie Wilkes. And the book dives deeper into Paul's psyche and the writing process. Next, let's talk about The Shining, one of my favorite books. The Shining is about a father named Jack Torrance, who is a struggling writer and recovering alcoholic, who takes a job as a winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel with his wife, Wendy, and son, Danny. Isolated by snow, the hotel's supernatural forces and Jack's inner demons drive him into madness. Now, Danny has a psychic gift, which is called The Shining, not to be confused with the one in The Simpsons, The Shinning, which they use in order not to get sued. In The Shining, this power helps him sense the evil within the hotel and survive his father's breakdown. Fascinating thing about The Shining is that this is a gift where Danny can see into the future, he can see into the past, he can see and read people's thoughts, and he can also see spirits and those things that are not clear by the natural eye. Now, the motive for writing this book, for the reason why King wrote this book, some of his motives include, while battling alcoholism and fear of becoming a violent... Let me take a step back. So King wrote this story while battling alcoholism, and he had a fear of becoming a violent, neglectful father, which is very interesting, knowing that backstory of King having addictions to cocaine and alcohol, and just what that might turn, what he could eventually become, and that fear is essentially becoming a bad father, a neglectful father. And the story mirrors his fear that addiction could ultimately destroy his family, which in The Shining, unfortunately, that's exactly what happens. It's almost as if King was trying to manifest what his fear was. And that seems to be another common theme throughout all of his books, is that Stephen King is really writing about his own fears, whether it's his fear of addiction, is it a fear of a crazy fan, which that might be oversimplifying it, but I think it's interesting to see that element in all of his books, most of his books. Key themes found in The Shining are addiction and self-destruction, isolation and cabin fever, the cycle of abuse, and the supernatural evil as an extension of psychological darkness. Symbolism behind the book is that the Overlook Hotel is the haunted mind of Jack Torrance. Now, there's the hedge maze, which I like that they don't go into too much detail with the hedge maze, especially the hedge maze animals in the movie as compared to the book. In the book, when you read about the hedge maze, there are these animals that are cut out and at times you see them move, and eventually they do become monsters, which I think is a bit much. I kind of like just the supernatural, ghost, demonic aspect of the Overlook. But that represents psychological entrapment. And then there's the boiler, which is Jack's simmering rage and self-destruction. Because in the book, what ultimately happens is the boiler, which is very finicky, has to be maintained, and it is not maintained because Jack becomes a monster. And as a result, it explodes and destroys the hotel. Let's talk about the book versus the movie. So, Stanley Kubrick, his film was released in 1980. It is a lot more psychological and less supernatural. Jack is unstable from the start, and in the book, his descent is tragic and gradual. So, key difference there between the book and the movie, which I agree with, is that in the book, it's a very slow, gradual. It's a gradual decline into the abyss. Unlike in the movie, it's there from the beginning. And King actually really disliked the film for stripping away the emotional heart and redemption arc that he included in his book. In 1997, there was a TV miniseries, which King approved and closely monitored, and that was much more aligned with the novel's tone. Next, Pet Sematary, which was released in 1983. So I'll give you a summary of this. This is about Dr. Lewis Creed, who moves his family to rural Maine. Like I said, a lot of his stories take place in Maine, near a pet cemetery and an ancient burial ground that brings the dead back to life, but not as they were. And when tragedy strikes his son Gage, who's sadly hit by a truck on a busy road in front of their house, Lewis buries him at Pet Cemetery, unleashing horror and madness. What is really tragic about this film is that it almost talks about the horror of losing a loved one, but having the ability to bring them back. But when you bring them back, there's an unnatural element to it, which is why there's a little bit of horror to this. For example, when he does this with the cat comes back, but it comes back a lot more like cold and cruel. And the same thing happens with his son Gage. When Gage is buried and brought back to life, he's destructive, he's cold, and he ends up running amok and killing. Now, what was the motive for King writing Pet Sematary? King wrote it after his young son nearly ran into the road, forcing him to confront his worst fear, losing a child. He considered it so disturbing, he almost didn't publish the story. And the key themes here are death and denial, the limits of human control, the danger of playing God, and the cost of grief. Again, this is probably going to be the third time, and I'll probably say it again. King writes about his own fears, and he helps us, his readers, also realize that, yeah, that's a legitimate fear. That's something I wouldn't want to endure. And the symbolism found in the book is that the burial ground is human refusal to accept death. You got the cats and the church, which is death's mockery of life. And they have the road in front of their house, which represents fragility of life and inevitability of loss. There is a film, of course, for Pet Sematary. In 1989, the film is a faithful adaptation. It's a cult classic for its eerie tone. 2019, there's a remake, modernized, changed who dies. It's actually Ellie instead of Gage, and added a darker ending. The novel is more emotional and existentially horrifying. It's less about monsters and more about human grief. All right, now on to our final book of the podcast, which is It, which was released in 1986. This is a long one. It almost looks like you're going to be reading the Bible, just with how thick it is. Now, It is about the boring town of Derry, which is also located in Maine, and a shape-shifting entity, often appearing as Pennywise, the clown. And it awakens every 27 years to feed on children's fear. Now, the Losers Club, which includes children in the town named Beverly, Bill, Ben, Richie, Eddie, Mike, and Stan, who have to face a terrifying ancient evil that feeds on fear, which is Pennywise. And as kids, they drive it away, but 27 years later, the killings start again. But now as adults, they have to return to Derry, remember their forgotten trauma, and face it once more. Their bond and courage, not just weapons, are what ultimately destroys the monster. Now, the motive for King writing It is that it acts as a kind of summation of his entire imagination, childhood fears, small-town America, and the battle between innocence and evil. And Derry represents his fictionalized version of Bangor, Maine, his hometown. And the book explores how childhood trauma echoes in adulthood and how memory and fear shape identity. Now, some of the key themes found in this is the power of friendship and memory, childhood innocence versus adult corruption, fear as a form of control, the cyclical nature of evil, trauma, and healing. With this symbolism, let's talk about Pennywise the Clown. He's a manifestation of primal fear and deception. I also think that the clown image is interesting because it is fear. Fear really is a mockery to you. It is teasing you, kind of like a clown. And it's something that you have to face head on. Now, the sewers, or the underground. This represents the buried traumas and hidden sins of society. Next, the town of Derry, a microcosm of America's collective denial and apathy towards evil. And it itself is evil as a shapeless, ever-present force, not just supernatural, but social and psychological. All right, let's talk about the book versus the movie. In the 1990 miniseries, Tim Curry's Pennywise became iconic. Campy, but chilling. In 2017 and 2019, there was It and It Chapter 2. They split the story into two chronological parts, childhood and adulthood. It was more modern with updated scares and deeper emotion, especially around Beverly's trauma and friendship bonds. And the book drives far deeper into each character's inner life and the mythology of it. I highly recommend the book. There's a little weird aspect to it. Just look it up, see if you're curious. But the miniseries is excellent. The films are well done. And Welcome to Derry, I'm excited about. Episode 1 just recently came out. So let's talk about each of these books and kind of the common themes. So between The Misery, The Shining, Pet Sematary, and It, you find themes of isolation, addiction and obsession, evil as a reflection of self, family and love, and setting as character. So starting with Misery, with isolation, you got Paul, who's trapped by Annie. In The Shining, the family, they're trapped in the Overlook Hotel. Pet Sematary, Lewis is isolated by grief. And It, the kids are isolated by fear and adulthood. Next, you've got addiction and obsession. In Misery, Annie is Paul Sheldon's addiction. She's the author and he's the writer. In The Shining, you got Jack's alcoholism. In Pet Sematary, it's Lewis's obsession with death. And in It, it's Derry's addiction to forgetting. Next, you got evil as reflection of self. Annie mirrors Paul. In The Shining, the hotel mirrors Jack. In Pet Sematary, the burial ground mirrors grief. And in It mirrors human grief. Next, you got family and love. In Misery, it's the destruction of creative freedom. Paul Sheldon, who's trapped by Annie. In The Shining, it's family bonds are broken. In Pet Sematary, family love is his family love turned deadly. And in it, it's friendship as salvation. And last, you've got setting as character. In Misery, you got Annie's house. In The Shining, the Overlook Hotel. In Pet Sematary, you have the burial ground and the town. And then in it, you have Derry, Maine. Now, this is coming to a close, and I want to talk about Welcome to Derry, which is the prequel to It. I'm optimistic about this series, and I'm going to provide a summary of what the series is about and how it kind of fits into the overall King universe. Because what's really interesting is as you read these books, you see references to and characters that overlap between the different stories. Like, for example, in The Shining, the film, you hear about Paul Sheldon going missing, which is a reference to Misery. And in It, you also have references to other things going on, such as Shawshank. And let me go ahead and give you a rundown of what the series is about. So as I mentioned before, the series is a prequel to the films It and It Chapter 2, which are heavily rooted in King's novel. Now, It is set in 1962 in the fictional town of Derry, Maine, 27 years prior to the main events of the films. Now, the plot focuses on a number of disappearances and strange phenomena affecting children and townsfolk in Derry. You got Major Leroy Hanlon, and eventually his family arriving in Derry via the nearby Air Force Base, becoming entangled in the town's dark history. Now, this is interesting because Hanlon is a reference to, well, hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll unpack that here in a moment. Next, we got the malevolent entity known as Pennywise, the dancing clown, or It, stirring up fear, chaos, and evil undercurrents in Derry. Now, the series draws from the interludes passages in the King novel, so the segments where the town's recurring horrors and past cycles are outlined. And there, for additional historical and cultural threads at that time, you had racial tension, the Cold War era, you also had 1950s music, and these are all woven into the dark story to deepen the backdrop of Derry's dark past. Now, here we go. This is how it relates to Stephen King's universe. If you couldn't tell, I was wanting to talk about this very early on, but I've had to restrain myself, so here we go. Derry is not a standalone location in King's work. It appears repeatedly as a setting for supernatural events, shared horror, and the intersection of myth and small-town America. This series explicitly ties into other King stories. For example, the character Dick Halloran from The Shining appears in the new series, connecting it to The Shining's lore. And the underlying mythos of It, including its cosmic origins in King's larger multiverse, the Macroverse, total space, is also referenced, suggesting that the entity is part of a broader cosmic horror framework in King's world. Now, the timeline of Derry's periodic horrors, which is every 27 years, is central in King's novel. Welcome to Derry picks an earlier cycle, thereby expanding the mythos rather than merely retelling. And it's through these connections, Welcome to Derry becomes part of a shared King multiverse. His characters, locations, and themes overlap across what might first appear separate stories. I'll also add that in the trailer, because only one episode has come out at this point, in the trailer you do hear references to Shawshank as well as some of the other stories. But why is it significant and what to watch for? If you're a fan of King's interconnected universe, this series offers new territory, which is exciting. It explores the past of Derry, fills in the gaps, and shows how the town's, quote, sickness takes root. It brings forward social and historical themes, like I mentioned before, racial tensions in 1960s America, Cold War paranoia. In the first episode, you hear about the kids worrying about a nuclear holocaust occurring and what to do, like ducking and cover underneath the desk, as if that's going to make much of a difference, and generational trauma. And all these elements are used to amplify the horror. So that's it. That was a lot to unpack, but I highly recommend reading Stephen King. If you're someone who's not really into the macabre, then it might not be for you. But I do think it's well worth reading some of his books. The writing is high quality, and it's not super. When I say not super advanced, I'm referring to the idea that you can read it even as a teenager, and you're going to understand what's going on. The writing is really well done. It has great flow, great storytelling. It's very engaging, and I highly recommend it. The books I recommended today, Misery, It, The Shining, Pet Sematary, are personally my favorite. I think that his first book, Carrie, that was the first big hit. It's also worth a read. But those 4 books are my favorite, and I typically read all of them except for It, probably on an annual basis, because It is massive. I do recommend listening to the audiobooks as well. The audiobook of It is probably the best way to go because you can listen to it while you're driving, running, and it'll help you get further along. Because I think if you listen to the audio recording, it's like 48 hours. So just imagine how long that's going to take you reading. That's it for today. Thank you very much. Tomorrow is Halloween. Happy Halloween. I hope you all have a wonderful season, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you, everyone. Give us a follow on YouTube and social media. Thank you. Bye-bye.